Je prends déjà les grands. Θα βάλουμε κάπου το γραφείο. Το βάλουμε εδώ.
Yeah, I hear you.
Can you say something about today? So we can send the, the mic?
Okay, we're here from Brooklyn, New York. We're excited to be here to talk about the prison strike and resistance in the United States and what we're doing to fight against modern slavery in the U.S. Is that good? Does it sound good?
It sounds really good. Hold on. Let me just fucking put a screenshot on this thing so we get all these in there. Hold on. Alright, let me just get this fucking screenshot bullshit. Sorry guys, and this is in English until the question and answer period, so if you don't speak English, I'm also sorry. The first person I tried to give a flyer to said they don't, so that should be interesting. Let me just get this.
Okay, the comrade here wants to make a question if there's a problem from everybody to record this.
It's okay to record it. I suppose that during the question and answer, they might want to ask the people speaking. But for the people here, it is okay to record it. I'm just looking for... and so we were originally supposed to have a live video presentation, and of course because of Streffy, the reception is really bad. So we're just going to show a picture of something on the projectors and then play audio from a Signal application. And we hope that you'll understand. There you go. Okay, so there's this. And I will first off, for now, it will be in English until the question and answer period. And like I said, originally it was supposed to be a live presentation on Zoom, but we don't have Wi-Fi in the squad. We're using a hotspot, and the reception around Streffy is just awful. I was going to apologize if it didn't work during the presentation, but it's already fucked, so this is what we have. So in 2016, there was a prison strike in the States. In August 21st, this year there'll be another prison strike. The strike is for forced labor inside the American prisons, which is something that stems originally from slavery, and is something that is even outsourced to private and public companies, where prisons sell the free labor of prisoners who have no choice but to work. There's very little coverage, but in September 9, 2016, the largest prison strike in U.S. history happened. It happened with thousands of prisoners across the country, dozens of prisons refusing to work for free, demanding better working conditions, demanding a living wage, and demanding some respect from the prison authorities. It was organized primarily through smuggled cell phones that were brought into the prisons. And there was a large outside effort by anti-prison and anarchist groups to help coordinate between the prisoners. Whether that was from sending literature inside the prison, or if it was helping to send messages between prisoners, or raise awareness about the prison strike. RAM is a part of some of the outside organizing efforts of the prison strike by anarchist groups in the States. They'll be discussing today the historical elements of what is causing the prison strike, meaning slavery, the current social elements of American prison generally, and also some information about the prison strike coming in August 21st this year, to try and encourage solidarity, whether it's just simply to raise awareness or to create solidarity actions, etc. RAM is a group originally out of New York. However, it has a few independent groups across the states. It stands for Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement. The term abolitionist stems from the anti-slavery days of people resisting against American slavery. Some of their projects that they've been working on was, for example, sending in revolutionary literature to prisons across the states. Now specifically focusing on revolutionary literature to create more awareness inside of the prison about the strike, and also to try and simply send in political literature to the States, because in the States we try to give free radical literature to people in prisons, regardless of political prisoner, social prisoner, because typically we see people inside of prison sharing some degree of hatred for the state, for capitalism, for the police, etc. They also run a mental health collective out of Brooklyn. They're also organizing an array of anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-police actions in New York and also across the country. They've also created a social center, or I suppose you would call Steki, here in Brooklyn, New York, which focuses on providing a place for writing political prisoners, having political prisoner events, a place for the Anarchist Black Cross in New York City, a place for self-defense training among anti-fascists or people interested in these types of things, such as we do here, and more. Before we start, I want to also make this event somewhat of a success, as the technology has already kind of failed us. Yesterday was a day of international solidarity with one of our anarchist political prisoners in the States. His name is Eric King. He a few years ago, through, one moment. If you guys want to pass these flyers around, it has some information on his case. He's doing 10 years in prison for throwing a Molotov cocktail that did not break. It just broke the bottle at a government building, and he was facing 25 years if he went to court for attempted arson, weapon of mass destruction, other ridiculous American-style prosecution, and he took a negotiation of 10 years in prison. He's in a very high-end federal prison. He's also anti-fascist white prisoner, which creates a very hard survival situation inside of the prison. He's also an anarchist and a boxer, and would probably love this space. And sending letters into prisoners in the States is something that we do because it's an immediate victory. You know, it's not something beautiful like a riot or something in the streets, but every letter that's received by a political prisoner really helps them to find hope, to know that they're supported on the outside. I myself spent a year and a half inside of juvenile detention, and the letters I got was the only thing to keep me going. And yesterday was the International Day of Solidarity with him. You can read the flyer to learn more about him. And his birthday is on August 2nd. So in the States, usually for political prisoners, the Anarchist Black Cross has a birthday writing. So we look at the birthdays of political prisoners and we make solidarity birthday cards. So his birthday is on August 2nd. Today is June 29th. His day of solidarity was yesterday. We know that we can't send directly to the prison from Greece, or they will not accept it. They will deny it, or they will say it didn't arrive. So we're going to have to send it to a group in New York that will have to send it onward to the prison. And also make sure that it fulfills all the standards, because you can't, there's many small things that might allow them to deny the card. If you read about his case and you feel upset or you have solidarity with him and you want to say happy birthday, it's completely anonymous. I myself am a generally paranoid person, but I've signed many of these cards and have never had a direct problem as a result of it. I suggest just saying something simple, happy birthday from Greece, maybe try to write in English, because it's possible that since something is in a language they don't understand, they might also deny it. Someone can probably help you with that if you ask. But I'm going to pass this around with a pen. If you're comfortable and if you feel like you have solidarity with him, please sign it. It will make this whole event in itself a victory. I'm going to pass this around now too. Okay? That being said, I was also going to apologize about the Wi-Fi if it didn't work, but that already got fucked up. Generally, we're going to try and listen to the audio of these people. This is a screenshot, and I really hope that you understand the English. And afterwards, there'll be a question and answer period, which there'll be Greek translation available for you. Okay? Okay.
Yo.
Yo.
How's it going?
It's good. I can hear you clearly. Can you guys hear him clearly speaking English? Okay. All right. I did an intro for you, and this is as good as it gets. So feel free to start talking. There's a screenshot of you on the projector.
Okay. Okay, cool. Hold on.
What's up, everyone? So, to give a little background on who we are. We are the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement. We're a revolutionary anarchist organization, militant abolitionists. And basically, we start from the premise that the Civil War has never really ended in the U.S. And basically, slavery was really just transformed into something else with the rise of the prison industrial complex here. And so we view our fight, our struggle, really as a struggle against modern day slavery. And we've been inspired by anti-state struggles and revolutions, like the Rojava Revolution, the Zapatistas, and also our own history of black militant struggle here in the United States.
Dr. Rowe. Hold on. I'm going to call them back, but in case you didn't understand, they said they are coming from a perspective believing that the Civil War never ended in the States, the Civil War regarding slavery, and that the slave slavery still exists, but it's been adapted to become modernized. Really sorry about this reception. Talk to me.
Yep. It cut out, huh?
Yeah, it cut out, as you said, Black Revolution or something.
Okay, so it cut out pretty early in. Okay. Alright, hold on.
So it's after the... You said... Okay, so... Yeah. So, yeah, like I said, inspired by militant black revolutionaries in the U.S. and also anti-state revolutionaries outside of the U.S. But we're based in Brooklyn, and we organize out of this space called The Base, and it's an anarchist political center. The Base has been around for 5 years now, but RAM itself has been around for just a little over a year now, and we also have branches all over the U.S. and a book called "Burn Down the American Plantation," which you probably see down there. And so to explain a little more about like how we view slavery and its connection to U.S. society, we argue that the United States was founded as a slave society, and the idea of race and class are connected to slavery and anti-blackness and whiteness and all these things. Basically, slavery was different in the U.S. compared to most other slave systems around the world by the fact that the condition of the slave was hereditary. It was passed down to people. They couldn't escape it. It was, seen as part of their essence to be slaves. And so what we argue is that most of our way of looking at the world is kind of through this framework that, the Western society and Western civilization is inherently anti-black and is kind of sustained by anti-blackness. And so, the West, the United States, Africa, Europe, all of these terms basically come into being through the slave trade and colonialism, and our modern world system basically came out through this process. So basically, capitalism, even though exploitation is a part of it, we argue that basically the relation of terror and slavery is much more important in terms of understanding it and fighting back against it, especially here in the U.S.
Cool. Yeah, so we're going to talk really a bit briefly about the black struggle in U.S. history, just to give a context of where we're coming from. When we use the phrase abolitionists, we are talking about prison. When we use the phrase abolitionists, we are talking about prison abolition, but we're also rooting it in the abolitionist struggle against slavery in the United States, which started around the 17th, 18th century. The abolitionist struggle was a movement that was focused primarily on abolishing slavery in the U.S. There was a more liberal struggle, but there was also a militant struggle involved in this. We view people like Nat Turner, who was an escaped slave, who went plantation to plantation, killing all the owners of slaves and their families. People like Harriet Tubman, who was also an escaped slave, who created what was called the Underground Railroad, who liberated people from bondage and helped them escape. There's also something that's called Maroon societies, which were autonomous societies in the South that people, escaped slaves, Native Americans, poor white people lived there, and they launched attacks against plantation society. And we view all of these as like being indicative of what we're trying to recreate. The Civil War in the United States, I'm not sure how well people are aware of this, but it was about abolishing slavery, but the northern side of the country was more concerned with just preserving the whole nation state. So it was a competition about different economic systems. In the South, they wanted to preserve slavery. The North wanted to move more towards a wage labor system. But we argue that the conflict was never actually resolved. That the North won the conflict, but that the core of abolishing slavery was never actually accomplished. Some of the issues in this are going to come up later in this discussion, but But after the war was resolved, black people autonomously joined to fight, and they created a bunch of autonomous institutions. There's a period immediately after the war called the Reconstruction period. In this period, there was a network of like autonomous progressive institutions that popped up all around the South. There was like free like public education, socialized medicine. Black people started joining like political organizations, and it was the first time anything like this had happened in the country. And as you'd imagine, there was immediately a huge backlash against this. To abolish slavery, the U.S. government in the Constitution added something, the 13th Amendment, which effectively abolished slavery, but it said that people could remain enslaved if they were incarcerated. So it now permitted slavery through incarceration, which is still in the Constitution of the United States, which gets an important point that we'll come back to later. So after the Reconstruction period, Andrew Johnson, who was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, launched a huge counter-revolution funded by the Southern slave-owning class, where they did everything they could to reinstitute things that gave slavery its essence. So they made a bunch of codes restricting black freedom of movement. They started giving all the plantation owners political power. They started criminalizing basic things of survival for the black populace. And this led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, who was a white supremacist terrorist organization. It led to a rash of lynchings where black people were being slaughtered all over the South. And this is also where Jim Crow, which was a system of segregation based around the entire South, came into being. There was a rise of resistance to this too that followed the abolitionist trend. There's people like W.B. Du Bois who started a group called the NAACP. He was a socialist who was really inspired by Marxism and the notion of the general strike and fighting back for labor power. There were people like Marcus Garvey, who was a black nationalist. He wasn't a socialist, but he was inspired with what he started was called the Back to Africa movement. And immediately linked to that, there was a group called the Nation of Islam, who Malcolm X was its main proponent, and he was what we would argue is probably the most famous and most important black liberation figures in the 20th century. He had a whole ethos of what he called by any means necessary, and he felt that militants had to organize as much as possible and as militantly as possible to defend black communities from the government and from white vigilante organizations. His work led to a huge swath of militant activity around the country. You had groups like this group called Deacons of Defense who started armed cop watch patrols. You had this guy, Robert F. Williams, who started an armed wing of the NAACP, where he put his militant rhetoric into practice and began doing self-defense for civil rights marches. But he also was pro taking the war to the white supremacist state. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, they had their organizational capacity was really vast, but they weren't part of an offensive strategic movement. They were mainly focused on defense and building up their institutions, but this culminates in the rise of the Black Panther Party, which was the most serious political organization probably in the 20th century for black liberation and for militant communist far-left political organizing. They combine internationalism, armed self-defense, and like community programs into a coherent political project. Their activities became a model for other militant groups in the U.S., like the Weather Underground, the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican organization, the American Indian Movement, which was an indigenous militant organization, and the Black Panthers, the survival programs, the community programs they made filled in gaps that the state had left open intentionally. They didn't give much. There was no like health services in black communities. The neighborhoods were notoriously neglected intentionally because they're viewed as an underclass. A lot of people aren't aware of is that the Black Panther Party had an underground clandestine wing called the Black Liberation Army, which was a clandestine armed struggle guerrilla organization that formed in response to the state's repression of the Black Panther Party. So the organization didn't form until the state started massacring Black Panthers. We view it as the most successful guerrilla organization in the U.S. in the 20th century. There was no centralized command structure, and they were organized as autonomous cells, and they had launched way over 100 attacks against the police, against politicians. They had cells operating all over the country, and they're by far the most important political guerrilla group at the time. They also, this is going to be very important, a lot of Panthers were politicized in prison. Their organizing work in prison was where they got a huge swath of their membership, so they ended up having a lot of organizational capacity inside the prison walls. One of the most famous Black Panthers was George Jackson, who was in Soledad prison in California. He became one of the most well-known political prisoners in the country, and he was actually murdered during a prison attempt. He tried to escape, and the pigs murdered him. There was several other instances of resistance in prison, like Assata Shakur, who is most famous she was broken out of prison by Black Liberation Army guerrillas and flown to Cuba, where she lives today. The state still wants to apprehend her, but she's still free. But there's plenty other Panthers. There's this anarchist Black Liberation Army fighter named Kwasi Balagoon, who he had broken out of prison several times. And every time he broke out, he continued the guerrilla campaign against the state. So there was a lot of the organizing in prison was really, it was really very preeminent and very important for their whole organizational capacity.
Okay, so not only were the Black Panthers organized in prison and organizing escape attempts, but also there was a lot of organizing within prisons, and there's a tendency that exists until today called the jailhouse lawyers, which started developing at this time. Those were people who were incarcerated, and they were organizing other prisoners. They were reading the law, and they were developing cases against the government for certain barbaric practices. And it's around this period that there was the Attica Uprising, which a lot of people see as the culmination of all the uprisings and prison resistance. This is at a prison in upstate New York called Attica. It started September 9th. It lasted till September 13th in 1971. And was in response to George Jackson being killed during his prison break attempt. So in Attica, there were 1,000 inmates who were involved. That's about half of the prison population. They took 42 officers and some civilians hostage and issued a list of grievances for their maltreatment in prison. In the list of grievances, the courts, governor, and Department of Corrections were referred to as vile and vicious slave masters. So even at this point, prisoners were very aware that their own incarceration was a continuation of slavery. Unfortunately, this uprising was put down with armed violence, and there were a lot of casualties, including 9 hostages and 29 inmates.
Yeah. So, in regards to all this, the revolutionary activity going on in the U.S. at the time, the government launched another counter-revolutionary program, which was called COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program. This program, they started disrupting civil rights organizations, Black Power organizations, communist groups. So they jailed hundreds of people through this program. They were spying on people. They were torturing people. They had murdered several prominent Panthers. There's one, Fred Hampton, who was a 21-year-old organizer in Chicago. They murdered him and some of his comrades while he lay sleeping in his apartment, and they sprayed his apartment with a couple hundred bullets till they killed him and killed several other people. The counterintelligence program was really successful in that, like, they managed to disrupt the organizational capacities of all these groups. They made everybody extremely suspicious because they would pass letters around, making it seem like there was infighting where there wasn't, and people didn't know who to trust. Once their activities were fairly well disrupted, the government launched a war on drugs. When the drugs, oddly enough, were brought in by the government, and then they launched a war against the said drugs that they were flooding the communities with. And this war on drugs led to huge swaths of the black population ending up in prison, and most of the black community becomes like a prison camp around this time, where there are just thousands of police everywhere arresting people. The prison population starts swelling, and this leads to a period in U.S. history that we call mass incarceration. People may not know this, but the U.S. now houses 25% of the world's prison population. We have more people in prison here than anywhere else by far. In New York City, for instance, people may have a hard time grappling with this, but we have almost 40,000 police officers now in the city. So it's practically impossible to travel anywhere and not see police. They're everywhere, and they're in every facet of life to some degree. African Americans and Latinos are about 60% of the prison population, even though they're a small percentage of the population itself. Something like 1/10, and I think it might be more than this, but most black people have been in prison or have some degree of relation with the prison industrial complex. One further thing is that the prisons were directly transformed from plantations a lot of times. So the correlation from slavery to prison is not fairly just based on the notion of people of labor and people having to do free labor, but these prisons are directly, physically former plantations that now house black people predominantly. So for an example of that, in Louisiana, there's a prison called Angola Prison, and it was formerly referred to as Angola Plantation. On this plantation, people had to pick cotton and could develop all this industry for a white supremacist society. Today, it's the same exact thing where it's people are doing the same exact labor practices on the same exact plantation, and it's just called prison now instead of a plantation. Also, one thing people may not recognize well in the U.S. from looking abroad, but the conditions of U.S. prisons are some of the most draconian in the world. The U.S. actually refuses to let any UN inspectors or anyone even come see these prisons because they're so horrific. Prison rape is really normal. It's a really daily occurrence. Murders in prisons are also a daily occurrence. People are consistently being stabbed, cut. It's a very familiar thing. Solitary confinement, where people are locked in a cell alone for extreme periods of time, is really common. For instance, some former Black Liberation Army fighters have done 45 plus years in solitary confinement in a single cell alone. And that's something that's really, I think, that's really unique to the United States. I don't think any other country really has it, where a person can be trapped in one cell for 40, 50 years. So, yeah, there's a real tremendous lack of medical care, food, medicine, phone calls. All these things are really difficult for prisoners to afford, and they make it almost practically impossible to afford with the prison wages. And also, less about mass incarceration. There's extreme sentencing guidelines here where people will end up doing something that generally in another country might get you a few months or a year in prison, or you'll end up doing 10, 15, 20 years in American prisons. So for really small things, you end up in jail, and a few of those small things can put you away for a very long time. For instance, in New York City, drinking a beer on the street will once get you arrested. People don't know that, but if you're walking off a can of beer, it's possible to spend the night in jail. If you do that several times and you get caught doing something else, then that can end up to doing 1 year to 3 years in jail. If you have a gun in the city, it's a mandatory 3.5 years in prison. So even if you don't use it, if you just have it. So that's something to think about, that the laws are really strict and really draconian, and it's for criminalizing the black population. Okay. Yeah, the response to this was, there was a movement in the U.S. called the Black Lives Matter movement fairly recently. I'm assuming people have heard of this, but it's a fairly recent response to the police killings and to some degree to the prison complex that exists. This started from Ferguson, Baltimore, and there were a rash of police killings where they were killing young black men, and there was a militant underbelly from this that we argue that this stems from the same abolitionist black liberation struggle that's existed previously. The Ferguson and Baltimore ones were extremely militant, where there were armed clashes with authorities. There are also uprisings in New York, Oakland, and Dallas, and several other places. It became a national phenomenon. There's a split between the more liberal tendencies and the more militant tendencies of the streets, and eventually the movement has died down, but it definitely transformed into what we're seeing today with the prison movement. Now, there's been a lot of organizing inside prisons for the last 20, 30 years. A lot of it's not really been acknowledged or reported anywhere. For instance, in Lucasville, Ohio, in the 1990s, there was a riot. There was a rebellion against the authorities, and the black liberation prisoners, Muslim prisoners, and white prisoners all got together and made a list of demands, and they demanded better conditions in the prison. Through the conflict, a few officers were killed, and the main prison organizers have been facing the death penalty ever since. The people who are on death row for this are now some of the main people also organizing the prison strikes that have existed in the U.S. since. If you fast forward to more recently, there are several other movements in each prison, in several different prisons, that have they've been coordinating with prisoners around the country to fight back against what they refer to as prison slavery. Now, if I could just reiterate, when we're talking about prison slavery, we're not talking specifically about people working for free, but we're talking about the overall societal conditions of prison that make slavery a prevailing institution in America, about how black people are still in bondage and incarcerated as they were in the 19th century. So the Free Alabama movement is a movement of prisoners in Alabama, and they helped organize what became a prison strike in 2016 that we're going to talk about in a second. There's also a man named Michael Kimball, who's an anarchist prisoner in Holman, who was very involved in helping organize that activity. There's another movement in Texas called End Prison Slavery in Texas, with its main organizer is a man named Keith Malik Washington, he was politicized in prison, and he's very active in organizing rebellious activities within Texas prisons. There's Kevin Rashid Johnson in Florida, he's the main coordinator of prison strikes in prison. So there's this network of politicized prisoners who are taking the forefront of fighting back against prison slavery today. There were several uprisings that have come from this, even just from day-to-day organizing that weren't involved in this prison strike. For instance, there's a prison called Vaughan in Delaware, Vaughan Prison, and I think it was 3 years ago, people had an uprising where several guards were killed, and about 20 people are now facing death row for this uprising, and these people are becoming some of the most politicized prisoners in the U.S. today.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, the most recent iteration of these uprisings is the 2016 prison uprising. That was the biggest of its kind in U.S. history. It included prisoners in 24 states, and that was primarily organized by the group mentioned called the Free Alabama Movement. The way that they organized it was based on their publication called Let the Crops Rot in the Fields. And I believe that publication is there with you guys in the room. And what they argued is that there was a number of ways to resist, but a lot of those ways ended up causing a lot of harm to the prisoners themselves. And what they figured is that because prison labor generates about $2 billion per year, if prisoners refused to go to work, if they did a work strike, then they would be harming that industry, but actually they would be preserving their own health and well-being. They made a list of grievances, and the main ones were to end prison slavery and to overturn the 13th Amendment. That is the amendment that pretends to abolish slavery, but actually just funnels it back into the prison system. This was coordinated, the strike itself was coordinated between inmates and groups outside, and it was launched on September 9th of 2016 in honor of the 45th anniversary of the Attica prison riots. Unfortunately, that uprising was put down in a number of different ways. A lot of the main organizers were moved or moved into solitary confinement, and the most attention that was possible to garner from that came from outside support, came from solidarity demos, came from spectacular actions. So because the people inside were facing very difficult conditions in getting the word out that they were happening, a lot of the prisons issued statements preliminarily saying nothing's happening here, there's been no uprising, there's no sit-in, there's no work stoppage, nothing to see here. And in that way they tried to quash it. The way that people outside were able to get information about it is that many of the prisoners had cell phones that were smuggled in, and they were able to let organizers outside know what was going on. So information came to us slowly in a trickle, but that's how people outside were able to communicate that things were actually happening, disruptions were actually happening. So now some of the same prison organizers and some new ones are working on the 2008 prison strike, the 2018 prison strike that's coming up this August 21st. It's planning to start it on the date that's the same anniversary as the Nat Turner Rebellion. That is a former slave who went around slaughtering plantation owners and setting the slaves free. And it has a time limit. It's supposed to run until September 9th, the anniversary of the Attica prison uprising. Actually, this prison strike was planned to start much later. But this year in South Carolina prison called Lee Correctional, there was a riot, and during the course of the riot, which lasted 7 hours, the prison guards actually locked the doors and didn't get people any medical attention. They let people bleed out on the floor. And at the end of the riot, 7 people were killed, not necessarily because they couldn't have been saved, but because the guards ignored their injuries. This was like a very avoidable tragedy. So the organizers inside prisons decided, instead of waiting another year for their planned prison strike, they wanted to go ahead and do it immediately this year to draw attention to the bad conditions that led to that situation. A lot of the organizing that's been going on has been actually communicated to the public through Twitter, through smuggled cell phones, and the inmates have been able to organize amongst themselves through a cell phone network around the country. So far, there's 17 states that have committed to participate in the strike, and a lot of outside groups are actually writing to people inside prisons and other facilities to let them know it's happening in case they want to join in. And as soon as the 2018 prison strike was declared, it caused a big wave in a lot of other prisons. For example, about a month later, at a prison in Missouri, prisoners staged a massive sit-in, and it escalated to the point where they hot-wired a forklift, and they broke into one of the work factories and smashed it to pieces. And at the Angola prison, the one in Louisiana that's renowned for being on the site of a former plantation, there was another massive prison strike. In both these instances, the prisoners made graffiti referencing the upcoming prison strike. So we know that actually the idea of having it is really igniting something in a lot of prisons, even if they haven't been formally organizing it from the start. Basically, the organizers are asking for people inside to engage in work strikes, sit-ins, boycott spending. This is important because they have a lot of predatory companies that make money off the calls prisoners make, the emails prisoners send, commissary, that is people buying food, toilet paper, other goods, are just hugely expensive. And a lot of companies make a lot of money off prisoners. The prisoners themselves, when they work, they're being paid a few cents an hour, whereas the products that they buy, the emails they send, are much, much more expensive. So this system of spending, it wouldn't be able to exist without outside support feeding it. So they're asking prisoners to boycott spending, not make calls, not buy anything from the prison store, and also to engage in hunger strikes. What they're demanding, they issued a list of demands, include immediate improvements of prison conditions, an end to prison slavery, that nobody can get life without possibility of parole. A big problem that happens inside prison is that people are sentenced to life in prison, and then they have nothing to lose. So they're the ones that people fear the most in certain instances. An end to racial overcharging and parole denials, and that black people should no longer be denied parole just because the victim was right, which is something that's very common. An end to racist gang enhancement time, and that no one should be denied rehabilitation access. The organizers are aware that these are demands for reform, but they're also aware that the only way to end the situation is to abolish prisons altogether. And because of that, they are very clear that their demands should create reforms where it'll make it easier for the prisons to organize in the future for what actually needs to happen for the abolition of prisons.
So the revolutionary abolitionist movement has a few projects oriented towards organizing inside the walls. Our whole program is to do, we're not much of a protest movement. We are in the streets a little bit, but mostly what we do is material benefits to prisoners. So for instance, we have a program called Support Through the Walls, which is, we send revolutionary literature to prisoners and begin this correspondence with them. And we've had a lot of success with that. We've started to really get a good relationship with a lot of prisoners on the inside. Some of them are political prisoners, some of them are just regular people, and some of them are also prison strike organizers. We also have a community bail fund. Bail funds are fairly common in the US, but they're usually geared towards activists. We wanted to make one that was just geared towards the community in general, and in fact, we don't use a bail fund for activists. We use it for people who don't have this sort of support infrastructure that most activists have. We wanted to give that to the community. So we bail people out who have bails between $500 and $2,500, which is a fairly common bail price, though a lot of them go a lot higher, and we don't quite have the capacity for those, unfortunately. But we have committed to bailing out one person every month indefinitely. We did a fundraiser that was really successful, and we've been able to do that. So we started in January, so I guess it's been 6 months, so we've bailed out 6 people, and we've kept in contact with them. We've bailed out a couple people from ICE detention as well, and we try to keep contact with them, support them through the process, because it's not just the jails, it's also the courts that just brutalize people, and we try to be there and offer support and try to help them through that so that the state has a harder time brutalizing them. We've also started a campaign to send letters into the prisons to let people know about the prison strike, people who might not know about it otherwise, to get as much spread for it as possible. And we're also organizing solidarity actions for the strike, including noise demos and other things. And we are announcing Nat Turner Day, which we hope to do annually. And this year, our Nat Turner Day, which is August 21st, is in honor of this year's prison strike. So you'll be hearing more about that soon. And so really one of the things we really want to do is to extend this organizing to an international scale, to spread international solidarity. So we're kind of asking people in other countries, other places, to do solidarity efforts, actions, what have you. Some ideas, though we certainly don't want to, stifle anyone's creativity. But some ideas, there's U.S. consulates, there's U.S. embassies. Those would be places where you could do something. Who knows what. And also, basically, I'm sorry. What? Oh yeah, so doing prisoner solidarity actions, and really the big thing that we want to let people know is that, as it was pointed out, the U.S. prison system tries to make it seem like nothing is happening. The prisoners inside feel extremely isolated and alienated, and so big thing is to let them know that A, they are not alone, and let the world know that this is happening, and to fight this huge atrocity together as an international network. And so we're hoping that with an international community, we can pressure the U.S. to letting up a little bit, which should open the door for even more revolutionary organizing, and eventually together. And abolish America altogether. Sorry, I got hyped. So anyway, that's our presentation. I guess we can take some questions now.
I hope people understood some of it from the amplification and the complication of the technology. If you guys have questions, we can also translate in Greek. Does anyone have any questions from what you've heard, or about the upcoming strike, or about making solidarity, or something? Yeah.
I think the very important thing is that you didn't say, they did not mention that they have a private system of jails in states, which is for the way we are, interpreting the prison system in Europe, that's very, very different.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, very important thing that they should also, that's the reason for all the conditions, that we have faced.
Hey, did you guys want to talk a little bit about how the difference between the federal and the private prisons are? Because people here aren't really aware of private prisons. Hello? Hello? Hold on a second.
I think you
Hello?
can explain also, you know what's going on.
Hello? Hello? I'm sorry, guys. Hello? the reception's bad. Either way, I will speak about it for a second, I guess. Yes, in the States, there's federal and state prison. Federal prison is typically where, for example, anarchist political prisoners would go, what the United States would consider Muslim terrorists or whatever they say would go. They're federally controlled. For example, if you're arrested by the FBI, which is quite famous, you would go to a federal prison. Typically, if you're arrested on small drug charges, you would go to a state prison. What she's asking about is in regards to the privatization of the state prisons. What happens in the States is that there's a huge political power by private companies that are building prisons. They are going to police conventions, to the state conventions about policing, to push for harder sentences, to push for harder punishment, because the more people that are put into prison, the more money they get. What's also happening with this is that, for example, what they were talking about with the 13th Amendment that was created that allows for forced labor or unpaid or low-paid prison labor to happen inside of prisons. A lot of people, companies like Starbucks, AT&T, even Victoria's Secret, they actually pay the prisons to produce their products. For example, in the States, if you call a customer service line, for example, you might, in some cases, actually be speaking to a prisoner who is working for free, or in some cases, 2 or 3 cents per hour. This is a way to create more profits for the private companies that own these prisons. Another example of how the privatization of the prison practices is if you make a phone call from prison to a family member. For example, you will, on a normal phone call, would cost almost nothing, maybe 5 cents per minute. In the prison, it can be up to 1 or 2 euros per minute to make a phone call, because every part of the prison is privatized to profit the company that created it. So obviously, if there's private companies that make billions, not millions, billions of dollars in profit building prisons, there's a motivation to keep building, to keep arresting, to keep imprisoning. And this has played a small part in how the prison population is constantly growing. I mean, also in some places like New York City, for example, where they're speaking from, the police every month have to arrest a certain amount of people, okay? So, the goal is for them to arrest a certain amount of people. They're going to target poor people or black people, because these are the sort of people that cannot defend themselves. What the group is saying, one of the most inspiring projects of this group, is that they are raising money every month to bail out a poor person who simply can't pay to get out. If you go to prison in the States and say you're a 19-year-old black kid who was arrested with a little bit of weed, okay, you will most likely not go to prison for 1 or 2 years for just having the weed. But if you cannot pay the $500 or $1,000 to be released until you go to court, you will stay in prison until you go to court. And there's been some disasters that have come from this. For example, in Rikers Island, which is one of the most notorious hard prisons in New York City, there was a kid who was arrested on a small charge. He ended up serving 3 years in prison, simply because he couldn't pay $1,000 or $2,000 to just get out and wait till trial. What ended up happening was he was so beaten and abused and assaulted because of prison life in America that he ended up killing himself. You know, and this is a story that happens again and again and again. And one of the projects they're working on, like they said, is just 1 time per month, helping someone just with $1,000 to get out, to avoid suicide, to avoid 3 years in prison for simply not having enough money to get out. But the whole prison system in the States, at least on the private level and the state level, is ran simply as a business. You know, and this is why you have 2.5 million people in prison. I mean, the size of Athens proper, okay? Additionally, that number does not include immigrants detain children. I mean, a lot of people now are looking at the immigration crisis in America. It's the big news now in the world. What's happening in the last few months where they're separating children from their parents. The companies that are housing those children and housing those parents are also private prison companies that get federal money. This year alone, they've already been given $500 million, which is $500 million, roughly 350 million euros, to build new prisons for the new policies of Trump of arresting immigrants, arresting their children, and so forth. So the private element of prisons is a big part why you can face 10 years in prison for a simple drug charge. And why cops, every month, if they don't arrest a certain amount of people, they might be punished, even if there's no one to arrest. For example, in New York, at the end of every month, when you're walking around or if you're driving, you always look twice the last days of the month because the cops are always out trying to get enough people arrested to fulfill the numbers that are expected from the prisons. So it's a very complicated subject that probably requires more discussion. But this is a very unique and specific thing to American prison life, where the prisons aren't only a form of punishment, they're an unbelievably successful business. And I hope that answers a little bit about the private prison practice. Are there any other questions? And I'm going to call them back if there's any other questions, and generally.
Can I ask you a question? When you pay the money to get out food, you don't get this money back. You just pay one time just to get out.
Okay, so there's also another private industry around this. Okay, it's called the bail bond. It's actually one of the most. It's completely disgusting, and it's actually a whole other subject. With the bail bond, for example, if you pay 10% of what you're owed, you lose it, and you can get out. Say if you owe 5,000, you can pay 500, and you can get out, but you won't get it back. And most of the people we're discussing, most people in the States live paycheck to paycheck. I mean, there's a very stupid, there's a very uninformed perspective that the States is everyone's rich, chilling. No, this is about 20% of the population. Most people are living from one paycheck to
20% of the population.
Yes, most people.
It's a very high. That's a very high percentage.
That are living, that are wealthy.
If it is, yeah, I don't think it could be.
Okay, 1%.
1%.
Okay, 80% are living paycheck to paycheck, generally. Living in constant debt, paying thousands for university, years and years, or just simply don't have jobs, or jobs that pay enough. But most people don't even have enough money for this. But say you have to go to a private company that will loan you the money like a bank, okay? And then they will keep a percentage of this over time, the money they give you. However, if you cannot pay them back, or you do not show up to court, they are also privately allowed to come and find you, like police, and then you face new charges. Okay, say if you went to prison for a small crime, you couldn't pay enough to get out, so you asked for this company to pay for you, but then you couldn't pay this company, then you have new charges. You face new charges of possible imprisonment. You face new possibilities of repression. Okay? So, yes, if you pay the full amount from your own money, you will get it back, maybe, after the course. And this can be 3 years, 4 years, you know? But generally, most people either owe money or they stay in the prison. Are there any other questions? I'm going to call them back.
Yeah, I would like to know if there's some particular actions that are made against the private companies owning those prisons.
Sure. I'm going to call them back now, and I'm really sorry about the technological problems. Yeah, I'm about to plug you back in. I just, we got lost. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, I can hear you. I just answered a few questions myself about some things. I'm going to plug you back in. And can you hear me now? Alright, fuck it. I don't know. Either way, there are actions against these private prisons, but it's, you know, it's hard. There's a group, for example, called ALEC. They're a group that, they're a political group that goes to Washington, D.C., for example, and they go to the politicians and they donate money to campaigns. They use political connections to push new policies, for example, to make it so cops have to arrest a certain amount of people every month, to make it so it's possible to raise the prices on phones prisoners use inside of the prison. Okay? And there has been coordinated efforts to show up to their conferences and resist, and there's obviously networks of resistance challenging these companies. But you know, they're very, very powerful, and most of our actions have typically been symbolic on the outside. But what's happening now with the strike that they were discussing in August is, as they said, the free labor in American prison produces $2 billion per year of profit for private prison companies, or generally. So this effort that's happening with outside influence from anarchist groups, anti-prison groups, Black liberation groups, etc. This is actually what's so inspiring about it. It's something that we've discovered that people really might be able to have an impact on this. And I think that their goal with this is, when it comes to prisons, like I said, the birthday card that we're sending, a lot of prisoner support is one of the few things that has victories. You know, it's, you know, you make people have some more hope. You have people know that they're being thought of on the outside, that people know what is happening on the inside. And I think their goal with this presentation was to try to encourage solidarity in Greece, whether it's you know, going to Korydallos for a noise demonstration, showing support for the prisoners locally, and writing a communique or responsibility so people in the States see. Because when they see that people outside of the prisons and internationally actually care about what is happening inside American prisons, it gives them hope. It gives them hope to resist, and it just simply gives them hope to continue surviving. I mean, you know, they mentioned the States. You know, you have rape, you have solitary confinement, you have forced labor. You know, these types of symbolic actions actually have a real impact. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Did that answer your question a bit? Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I have some questions.
Yes, please. I'm going to try, but I'm calling back. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, cool. I'm going to plug you back in. What's your question?
My question is, what's the level of participation of prisoners? What groups are involved? Because we know that the last prison strike was partly planned or organized by the Free Alabama.
That's a black option.
What's the organization outside? We know
she's asking, for example, what have been some of the developments since the 2016 prison strike? What are some of the groups that are involved now, other than yourself? What are some of the groups that have been developed inside the prison? Where are some of the more focused efforts coming from? Is there more momentum as a result of 2016? And also, what are some of the private companies that are benefiting from this forced labor? Hold on, I'm going to plug it. Hold on. Yo! Steve.
Are we back on?
Yeah.
Okay, so about the groups that have developed since the 2016 prison uprising, the Free Alabama movement actually doesn't exist as that anymore, although some of the organizers are still involved. A lot of organizers that are working independently within prisons don't identify themselves now because they fear the reprisals that happened during the 2016 prison uprising, and actually in the lead up to the 2016 prison uprising, many of them were put in solitary confinement or put pressure on in different ways by the state. So a lot of the current organizers are anonymous, but if you're on Twitter, you can follow a Twitter account called Prison Slavery, and that's one of the main organizers and also a mouthpiece for what the organizers are doing and the ideas and decisions they come to on their conference calls. Some of the organizers are actually based in South Carolina, which is why they were so sensitive to the riot that happened there and the deaths that happened. And the other group inside that's become more prominent is Jailhouse Lawyers Speak. And this is relevant too because that tradition of jailhouse lawyers came out of a lot of the prison organizing from the 1960s. So that's a little bit interesting that that trajectory has carried on.
There's yeah.
No, go.
Okay, well, there's also, for outside support, there's like us with RAM, which is organizing. There's a group called IWOC, which is a branch of the IWW, that's doing a lot of the organizing. Another organization called Fight Toxic Prisons. I think we're the three organizations that are doing the most outside support. Now, there are several corporations that make that profit off of prisons. It's actually a lot larger than most people would think, like from something like AT&T to Starbucks to Victoria's Secret, McDonald's. There's probably upwards of about 50 to 100 different corporations that profit off of this specifically. But yeah, it's pretty mammoth. As far as like from 2016 to 2018, the momentum has actually gotten pretty strong in that like people have a lot more connections now. People understand the repression they're facing in the stakes of what it takes to organize in prison. So when people first did it in 2016, I don't think people knew exactly what to expect or what kind of solidarity efforts would exist, but us outside and then inside, we're all a lot better organized this year around, so it's like, we think it's going to be a lot more successful. Yeah, if there's a website called Let the Crops Rot in the Field, there's a list of companies on there too, if people want to look up which companies exist. And one last thing, I guess, to finish talking about that. The United States right now is at a really big crossroads in that the country is extremely unstable. The level of violence on the streets elsewhere is extremely heightened with the rise of these fascist groups and with Donald Trump in the presidency. I think everybody feels that the country is headed for some kind of really serious conflict, and the prison strike is one of many facets of that larger fascist and anti-fascist struggle that's going on every day. the police, the federal authorities are extremely, they're extremely impassionate and they're extremely excited to continue repressing and hurting people and ethnically cleansing Latino people, expanding the prison systems. So like, this is one of many facets of fighting back against what's going on now. So yeah, every element of international solidarity right now is really important, and it'll do a lot as far as like rejuvenating and like heightening the struggle here. So I think that's it.
Also, the Let the Crops Rot in the Field, the zine that was compiled by the prisoners, it's available in here for free, our donation. And also, I wanted to, when we were cut out, I answered a question on my own, but maybe you want to. There was a question about some of the efforts going on organizing against these private companies or the general slavery inside American prisons. I brought up some of the organizing against the group ALEC, for example. But you have some examples of people on the outside showing solidarity actions or demonstrations, and also maybe how people could incorporate that into their solidarity here.
Okay, yeah, in 2016, for instance, like we targeted a series of companies that were supporting prison labor. So we would do demonstrations outside. People had launched direct actions against some of these companies. Yeah, there have been a series of different things. The most complicated part about it for us here is that there are actually so many. So it's like, people have targeted several of them, people have organized boycotts, but it's like there are quite a lot that do it, so it's like, we have had some sustained campaigns against some. Whole Foods is one company that actually stopped using prison labor, but a lot of the other companies don't have such a liberal facade, so the struggle is a bit large. But we would also argue pretty much targeting overseas, targeting pretty much any American company as far as we're concerned is completely justified. So yeah, so like, because they're all kind of complicit in this larger political system. But we've also targeted, there are a lot of series of private prisons here and private like detention facilities for immigrants. So we've targeted those within a larger campaign to put pressure on the systems of detention.
Are there more questions, or do you feel like there was some help to your question? Anyone? No? Okay. Yeah, sure.
What's the thinking behind doing like a fixed time strike?
Okay, there's a question. What's the thinking regarding a fixed time strike? Is it a fixed strike, or what is the deal with it?
It has like a deadline.
Fixed, you mean like it's timed out, right? It's not like, the dates are August 21st to September 9th. So it's fixed as far as that time goes, yeah.
Is there Is there a reason that it's fixed? They're not looking to push it beyond that time frame, or it's just a general goal?
Well, I think it's just a general goal. I think if it probably is overly successful, they would be into continuing it. But the two dates, one are symbolic because August 21st is the day of the Nat Turner uprising, and September 9th is the day of the Attica uprising. So they picked those two symbolic days to draw attention to previous resistance against white supremacy. But yeah, I think they also, because doing this inside U.S. prisons is really incredibly dangerous. So I think that they figure with a fixed date, it gives them enough leverage to continue resisting without facing what might be like overbearing repression, for instance. Because like what we were saying before, is that people can be thrown into solitary confinement for like 20 years, 30 years. So it's like, once you're thrown into something like that, your chance of organizing really diminishes.
Hold on.
And so doing it from a... Huh?
Hold on. Does everyone know what solitary confinement is in the States? Does anyone not know?
Can you say that again?
Solitary confinement. Do you know what this is?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so people can be thrown out for an extreme amount of time, and they're still risking that even just by going on strike. But I think they think if they have the fixed dates, one, it's symbolic, and two, it's like it gives them enough freedom to continue the struggle. Also, if there are any terms we may have used that may have been like complicated, because there's a lot of terms we realized that we probably had said pretty casually that probably don't translate too easily. So if there's any questions about things like that.
Yeah, are there any questions about words that were said or references that need kind of some Greeklish translation? No? Okay, so any more questions?
Yeah, just have a question related to the last topic.
Yeah.
Is there already some people placed in solitary confinement now that were catched in organizing the upcoming strike?
That's a good question. Is there already some people that are facing solitary confinement or preemptive punishment because of organizing around the upcoming strike?
Yeah, definitely. One main organizer, this guy, Kevin Rashid Johnson in Florida, it's not actually clear where he is. They've been transferring him and keeping him in increasingly isolated places. So he's definitely been facing a lot of repression. There's another fellow named Hannibal Shakur who he's also seemed to have been put into some kind of solitary, and nobody's really heard too much from him. So there's definitely been repression already. One person we've been in touch with a lot, Keith Malik Washington, he's been in solitary for a while as well. I think the conditions of his solitary are a little bit lighter than some other ones, but there's definitely been reactions to it, and apparently the prison guards in a lot of these places are going around and trying to find cell phones that people are communicating with. They're preparing to put a lot of these prisons on lockdown too. So they're preparing the force of repression right now, and there has been some pushback already. So yeah, there's definitely repression already.
Yeah, the States is fucked.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Can you ask me things that an uprising of the black people is possible in the next few years? If the situation is continuing to go like this with many black people getting shot and all tortured inside the jails, does he think or does he predict that something like that will happen?
What do you think about the question, do you think that there will be a peak of black uprising? I mean, since the Black Lives Matter thing, I mean, it became famous from Ferguson, but obviously it was also famous with Oscar Grant, and, you know, during the Maroons, it's ongoing. But do you think that in the next few years, especially as things are getting worse, that there'll be kind of a peak or a resurgence of mass black uprising or marginalized people uprising?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's going to keep escalating. Also, like with the general tenor of the country, it'd almost be shocking if it didn't escalate again, because the problems, the contradictions are too deep for it to like go away. Now, as far as like people necessarily marching like they were off of Black Lives Matter, that might not happen again for 2 years, 3 years. But I think in the US you see every certain amount of time there's a resurgence of that, because they don't really, within the system they can't really change the prevailing social order. Like the white supremacist nature of the country is really codified into the way the entire society is structured. So we think to change that, it would actually take some real serious revolutionary change. Because like, okay, so for instance, years ago you have Obama become the first black president, and that just leads to a rash of police killings and heightened mass incarceration. So every time there's even a slight kind of like pushback against the racist society, the blowback is 10 times more extreme. So it's like, I mean, I would imagine that it's going to keep escalating. And then in tandem with what they're doing with Latino people in this country, and the assault on the international order in the way that that Trump is pulling everything out, is disrupting the international order. You'd imagine that there's going to be some kind of really serious catastrophes here in the next few years, which will definitely lead to well, because when things fall apart for, like, say, white society, for black society, it's 10 times worse. So it's like there'll definitely keep being a resurgence of militancy, I think.
But it's also, you know, black uprisings are inherent to American society. I mean, in the 60s, you saw some of the large riots in American history in Watts, in LA, in Detroit. I mean, millions, if not billions of dollars from rioting that happened. And then there was the formation of the Black Panther Party. But then when they became exhausted, they formed the Black Liberation Army, which escalated the violence and started killing police. I mean, you look at Black Lives Matter. I mean, it became famous from Ferguson. But you look at '92, Rodney King in LA. You look at 2008, before Ferguson was popular, Oscar Grant in Oakland. And after constantly protesting in the streets, then you had a black veteran go and kill, I think, 3 cops in Baton Rouge, 5 cops in Dallas, something like this. I mean, it's a constant back and forth. It's a kind of informal civil war, you know, and it's just...
It be a civil war, like when you have tens of people on one side, on the black side and North, and then other people killed by somebody or somebody. It's just an extremist. It's not a civil war.
I think that the States is in a permanent state of civil war when it comes to the...
This is just a justification for extremities by the police. It's not a civil war. It cannot be a civil war when you have unarmed people. And when the state pays for their guns to protect people from armed people.
Okay.
It's not a civil war, but this is my opinion only, and I'm not American.
I think it's just, the point is, it's just like, the question was, will things become more and more? I think that they have been, and they will continue, and it's a matter of fluctuation. But as he was saying, right now is a very critical time in the States. You have Trump in power, which is making it so cops feel like it's a holiday to shoot black youth, for fascists to go around the streets killing trans people, gay people. I mean, it's the States is not generally, people are not generally fascist people, but the people who are very happy right now with the political situation. So from this, there will be the kind of permanent reaction of black unrest, Latino unrest, immigrant unrest, general unrest. We'll see though, you know.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, because even in like East Pittsburgh, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a few days ago, the police shot and killed a 17-year-old black kid. The cop had only worked for 90 minutes. It was his first hour and a half on the job, and he shot a black kid in the back and killed him. So it's like, it's a really standard thing. It's like normal, you know. So with that kind of normalcy, there's always gonna have to be resistance. So.
What was another question?
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm trying to form the question. I'm not sure if it was answered before, maybe I didn't understand. About the participation of prisoners. How is it done? Is it, I understand probably that there's gangs in prisons, but prisoners are organized in gangs, which is not necessarily a negative thing, but it's a fact. It's the same in Greek prisons also, and there's organized in ethnic lines also in Greek prisons. And I'm wondering if there is a horizontal way of prisoner participation, or is it through representatives?
Hello?
Yeah, through groups, leaders. And how is it between the gangs in this strike? Is there a truce? Are they collaborating? What's the situation there?
We lost him again, of course. I guess I'll try to answer it myself. Yes, in the States, in places like in California, for example, Pelican Bay Prison, as one example. It's not just the prisoners. Oh, here. Hey, there's another question for you. The question was about how people are living inside the prison. People are living inside the prisons, inside of gangs. So, for the purpose of the strike, are people organizing in a more horizontal way and having truces between the gangs? Are there leaders from the gangs that deciding if and when people will strike? How are people participating in the strike and breaking away from the kind of typical tragedy of how prisons are socially organized? And I'm going to plug you in now. Yo. Yo. Hello. Hello? Alright, fuck it. From what I understand, I'm not more actively organizing the way that they are in the States, but from what I remember in 2016, and also the Lucasville strike they mentioned, where there were, they took over the prison and there were 22 people murdered, 9 hostages. The actual people who were negotiating was the leader of the Black Muslim gang and the leader of the white supremacist Nazi gang. The thing is, in the prisons, for example in California, like I was saying, it's not just the prisoners. When you go into prison, the guards say, you're white, you go with the Nazis. You go with the Aryan Brotherhood. You're black, you go with the Muslim, Black Muslim group, which is Nation of Islam. You're Latino, you go with MS-13 or Young Lords or whatever Latino gang exists. And maybe I'm getting my names wrong, but these are some examples. So it's inherent and built into the prison society. But in these instances, when it comes to, the Lucasville strike, the Attica uprising, or the strike that happened in 2016, yes, there are truces between the gangs. The gangs work together and cooperate and horizontally. It's not perfect. You have Black Muslims working with white Nazis. This is a very, I'm sure for Greek standards, this is a very American phenomenon. But this is just what life is like inside the prison. From what I know, there probably are leaders who are helping to coordinate, but the main organizers are people that do organize horizontally, and also are, in some cases, in solitary or on death row, which means you are waiting to die, which is what death row is in the States. And they actually cannot be part of a gang because they don't have any human interaction. Their only ability to organize is through notes inside of the prison or by communicating through smuggled phones. But generally, and not just with the strike, people, when it comes to resisting the prison, resisting the conditions, resisting the guards, they usually drop their gang identity and work together, which I think is a very beautiful thing in itself, and kind of shows how when groups of people are forced to resist, they choose to negate or forfeit or give up their kind of nationalist identity or the things that separate them from other people that are experiencing the same thing. It's usually where people find the most sincere solidarity. It's not perfect. I'm sure horrible things happen. I'm sure there's snitches. I'm sure that there's some Nazi groups in some states that will try to fight against the strike. But in the places that it's happening, this is what is happening. People are getting out of the gang culture, and they are working together, and they are overcoming racism. They are overcoming a rape culture, you know? Yeah, I hope that answers a bit, and I'm sorry they couldn't answer.
Are there prisoners that are against this strike because they are scared of possible charges or other confinement, or is there a division created within as we go on?
I think that, yes, but also I think that in some cases that if you're at a prison that is fully on strike, you will be punished regardless. For example, if they're in Florida in 2016, they planned a strike, and what they did was just lock down the whole prison. Everyone was punished. So it didn't matter if you were supportive, participating, or not. Additionally, on the other end, if you, just like historically with any strike, the people who go to work experience consequences from the non-authoritarian side. So if there's a strike in prison and people are refusing to go to work, I think the biggest fear of prisoners is that if they go to work while others are striking, they will be beaten, or maybe worse. Which maybe sounds strange, but I think these are the unfortunate realities of having a strike in such awful conditions. Anyone else? Okay.
Could you tell us again what this group, who these people are?
Yeah, the name is RAM, and the abbreviation is a very long name. It's Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement. And it's anarchist group that's coming from, that's kind of forming out of the Black Lives Matter movement that happened the last few years, trying to incorporate more of a black analysis into their approach, to break away from the typical, I suppose, university or white middle-class anarchist scenes. So they're trying to reach outside of the typical groups of people. And actually, if you want to know, they have a book that they published that we printed here as a zine, and you're more than welcome to take it. Please donate. The money will go for the gym. But it's right there. It's called RAM. It has their whole political analysis. And also, at the same time, there's other zines, specifically Let the Crops Rot, that was compiled for and by prisoners that you can also read.
And what does abolition stand for? I don't know.
Yeah, it's been a repeated thing. Abolition, it means, in its purest definition, it means to simply get rid of something for good, to get rid of it, to destroy it, but not the same. And abolitionists, in this sense, the abolitionist movement, when we use it in the States, it refers to the people during slavery that were going and liberating slaves, and were going and killing slave masters. As they mentioned, Nat Turner or Harriet Tubman are two examples of abolitionists. In this sense, they want to incorporate this kind of anti-white supremacist approach that is historical in the States, but has always been used as a kind of liberal thing. You know, we used to have slavery, but now the black people are free. But now they want to have a revolutionary approach to this analysis. Anti-authoritarian or anarchist approach, militant approach, and so forth. So the term means abolitionist, means against slavery, to just get rid of slavery. But in this sense, it's a kind of modern use of the word, and to incorporate it into an anarchist project. But there's more information there too, and I don't know if there's any other questions. I know they really appreciate it, and I'm really sorry about the reception. It's fucking stressful. I'm going to try and call them one more time, and so maybe there could be some.
So is this movement inside the prison? Is it only inside prison or is it outside?
This is outside, typically. I mean, it's groups that are organizing outside the prison in solidarity with people inside.
Is it about, what is it, it's called, what is it about? I mean, is it about black people in the society? In part. I mean, it's about, I mean, our anarchist group, so in the long run, it's about eliminating the state and capitalism, obviously. But for them specifically, it's they're not a liberal group. I mean, we can't say they're going to solve one problem. I mean, what they're doing is they're sending literature into prisoners.
They're showing solidarity with people that can't afford to leave prison, so they're giving money to help liberate people. I mean, they're not an NGO. They do what they can. They're not looking to solve one specific problem. They're just a group that is specifically coordinating court communication between prisoners inside through sending letters from one to another, from sending propaganda to one prison to another prison, and also to raise awareness so there's more outside solidarity, which was the point of this event. They're doing many things, but in this case, they're doing this.
Okay, is it mostly about prisoners and forced labor in prisons?
The discussion today is because it's related to the strike in August, but it's not mostly about something. It's mostly about challenging the everyday life of state and capitalism. And in this case, they go around filming police when they're arresting people. They go to support solidarity with people striking inside. This is small things that they're doing to resist. I mean, they're not, I don't know, they're doing many things. They're challenging domination and exploitation where they can. And specifically incorporating an anti-racist analysis because it's something that we have to do in the States because we actually have real diversity, you know? And you can't just say, oh, you know, here, be an anarchist, you know, to a kid who hates the police just as much as any anarchist who's in a gang in Baltimore who watched his friend die. You have to become, I think, a little more creative and aware of race politics, for example, which this group is specifically trying to do. Anyone else? Yeah.
Should I translate in general? Okay. Well, she's asking, she said actually, I'm trying
Okay,
the general.
I can say the message. Shortly. informed that in 2016, when the last strike took place, there was an initiative from the Assembly, Solidarity Assembly of political prisoners and persecuted fighters, in which I was participating, to call an open assembly on this mobilization. And this open assembly did many, it gathered a mass of people, it did many solidarity moves, quite dense in a short amount of time, and it created a big noise about this issue, which reached the prisoners in the States, and it was a very important solidarity move for them. The actions ranged from blockade of Starbucks, blockade of McDonald's, as companies that profit from prison labor, gathering outside Korydallos prison, and occupation of the Hellenic American Union, where we were all arrested and we still have court trial today. And I was just saying that I am not, personally, I do not come from a political body that can suggest something like this now, to suggest an open assembly to mobilize on this issue. But I throw it as an idea, because I think it is important to, aside from initiatives that the Olympics can take, to have an open, common procedure that can mobilize on this issue.
I think it's a great idea. Is there a way to, do you want me to relay that to the person that in New York, or it's something that to do here?
I think this is addressed to the local.
Okay, nice.
Okay, can I speak on this? Can I comment on this? Well, I think that, first of all, this is something very new to me, because due to some specific conditions, I did not have knowledge of the 2016 action but now that I hear of this, as I understand it, I think that this thing that is supposedly called capitalism of America, it's actually financial exploitation of the whole country by a very small elite, and financial exploitation of other countries too, including war. It's something that is much broader than prison, and I think we should have a much broader perspective on this. And we should have more discussions and more analysis on the American society, and not only prisons, because it's not enough. I think that oligarchs, I think that big companies and politicians that are corrupted and are lobbying with them, and everyone that is actually involved in financial and any kind of exploitation of our people, and in crimes mostly, like illegal imprisonment, or like he said, arresting people just to reach a number, or because they are black, or because of anything. Well, I think this is just a very small part of the problem. I think the big part is the American society that influences others due to its mentality that it has to have a constant war against all other countries. I think we should focus and narrow our perspective on the American society and not any war or anything else in the world that it does, and understand how this society works and what needs to be brought down completely. And this is big companies, corrupt companies, and those that exploit crime. This is my opinion. I think we should have more discussion and analysis of this. Well, maybe participating in this is a good idea, but I don't think it's enough. Also, I don't think people should put themselves in danger by doing things that can get them arrested. You can have the word spoken without doing a crime, and mostly you need to have a very web-based opinion that is based on facts and knowledge, and not just do things thinking that you are changing the world and you just do nothing. You should focus more on ideology and analysis and less on actions that are too fast. have little results and are not addressing the main issue.
Well,
what do you think?
I think that maybe this is a longer discussion, but I think getting arrested sucks, but I think it's also possible to commit crimes and be smart and not get arrested. I don't think it's so.
I don't think it's smart to do crimes.
I don't agree with that
Not do
whatsoever.
crimes.
The state of the people that, this is a totally different discussion, but I just, they probably have work because it's the States and they have to make money to pay their rent, so I am going to just end it now, and maybe people can talk amongst themselves. And there's a bar on the roof for the rest of the night. That's a solidarity event for Tamio, a local group supporting political prisoners here. Thank you for coming, and I'm really sorry about the technology bullshit. Strefi has very bad reception. And they say thank you, and I think that the idea of an assembly is something they're very happy about.